Welcome back to This is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about Commander, Tough Rules, and Cool Interactions, episode 39. Today's episode is going to take a lengthy and in-depth look at a specific card and just try to clear up some of the confusion around what it actually does and what it does not do. It's one of the most powerful protection spells in all of Casual Commander, and it is of course Teferi's Protection. One of my friends recently mentioned to me that there are some loopholes to Teferi's Protection, and I agreed with him that there are. But then he mentioned one of the loopholes, and it sadly was not a real one. He mentioned that he had heard it talked about during a podcast, so I checked out the episode, and they did have some things right, but got some things very wrong. So let's take a look at the actual text of the card and see if we can identify the confusing parts. Also, if you know the podcast and the episode I'm referring to, don't seek people out and do anything negative towards them. Magic is a super complicated game. It's why I have this series. It's why we have the Judge Academy, and even judges get things wrong all the times about the rules. We're all just humans, and we make mistakes. But if you ever encounter someone playing a Teferi's Protection in your games, and they make any of these mistakes, you'll be able to point out the error and explain the proper way to resolve it. Okay, on to the card. Teferi's Protection says, until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you gain protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out. And then the last part of it resolving is that it exiles itself. As I said, this is one of the best protection spells in this format, but there are actual loopholes to it that can still lead to you losing the game. There are cards out there like Angel's Grace, which says that you can't lose the game this turn and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Until end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. But of course, Angel's Grace does not save your permanents, which can almost be just as bad as losing the game, as is having your life total getting reduced down to 1, which both of those can be prevented by Teferi's Protection. So both of these cards have some shortcomings, but this episode is going to focus on Teferi's Protection. So let's get started with what it actually does protect you from. Teferi's Protection first states that your life total cannot change. So if an opponent swings all out at you with creatures or they're attempting to kill you with a massive burn spell, this just won't work to kill you. Especially important, it also helps you to survive something that is typically even harder to stop, which is effects that drain your life. Often found in aristocrats types of decks. So this first part is great for sure. A slight note on this, it will also stop you from gaining life. This probably won't come up often, but anything that would set your life to a higher value, or if your opponents were to play something that says your opponents gain in life, then you wouldn't be able to gain that life. The next thing that Teferi's Protection does is give you as the player protection from everything. This is where some confusion can happen, as a lot of players do not know exactly what protection does. It's typically found on creatures, and I have an episode planned in the future that does do a deep dive into protection, but for the purposes of this episode, I'll focus on 3 of the 4 things that protection does. First off, protection from everything means that you can be dealt no damage from those sources. More specifically, you prevent all damage dealt to you. Usually, this would be important for spells like Banefire that say Banefire deals X damage to any target. If X is 5 or more, this spell can't be countered and the damage can't be prevented. So if you targeted a creature or player with protection from red or everything, then something like Banefire would still get its damage through. But luckily, Teferi's Protection has already stated that your life total cannot change. So we don't need to worry about that. And beyond that, the other part of protection is that it makes it so that things of those qualities cannot target the protected thing. In this case, you have protection from everything. So any spells or abilities yet to be cast until your next turn will not be able to target you. And this will also include any spells or abilities that are already on the stack that were targeting you. As they try to resolve from the stack, they will again run a legality check, and they will now see that you are not a legal target due to the protection. And then the final thing worth pointing out that the protection from everything does is it makes it so that you cannot be enchanted by any auras. This means that any curses that your opponents have enchanted onto you as a player will be sent to their owner's graveyard as a state-based action. Sadly, though, any beneficial auras that you have put onto yourself will also fall off of you and be sent to your graveyard as well. Unfortunate, but I've seen a lot of players miss that part. Finally, Teferi's protection causes all of your permanents to phase out. Phasing is a fairly rare thing, though lately WotC has been printing more cards that use it, so more and more players are becoming more and more aware of what it is. But still, it's pretty new. There will likely be a video sometime down the line that I'll do a deep dive into it, but for now I'll keep it fairly short and sweet. Basically, this means that all the permanents you currently have out as of the resolution of Teferi's protection will be treated as if they do not exist. Any board wipes, targeted removal spells, combat damage that would be dealt to your creatures, and anything else that would affect them in any way, it just won't, as they're treated as if they don't exist. And yes, this includes tokens, as tokens are permanents, and yes, they will phase back in with everything. A token that is phased out doesn't cease to exist. No zone changes happen with phasing. It's important to note here that this only applies to your permanents that are currently out on the battlefield as Teferi's protection resolves. For example, you cast a Genesis wave with X equal to, let's say, 20. Genesis wave says, reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of permanent cards with mana value X or less from among them onto the battlefield. So if your opponent tried to kill you with a lethal X damage spell in response to you casting the Genesis wave, and then in response to that, you cast your Teferi's protection, that means that Teferi's protection will resolve and phase out all of your permanents currently on the battlefield, and then the X damage spell will try to resolve and fail because you are now protected. But then you will still have that X equals to 20 gen wave that is going to resolve. All of the new permanents that you put out onto the battlefield through it will not be phased out. Anything that has an ETB trigger will still trigger. Any hasty creatures that you get out would be able to attack if you did all of this during your pre-combat main phase, and any lands and mana rocks that you get will be able to be tapped for mana. This means that all these new permanents you get out will indeed be able to be interacted with, as they're not protected. This also leads into the next section, which is the things that Teferi's protection does not protect. All it does protect is you as the player and your permanents that were out. It does not do anything at all to your hand, your graveyard, or your library. Opponents can still exile your graveyard with their scavenger grounds. If an opponent's Mind Slicer dies, you will still have to discard your whole hand. And if an opponent plays a Maddening Cacophony kicked, then you will still have to mill half of your deck. Each of these things affects cards in those zones that are not protected in any way by Teferi's protection. It's important to note that each of these cards I've just mentioned do not target you, which is why you would still be impacted by them. Having protection from everything will not save you from these effects if they do not target target you. In the example from earlier with the Genesis wave, you'll still have your hand, and like I said, you'll be able to tap those new mana rocks and lands that you got. So you would be able to cast more spells from your hand, just as you can still be forced to discard cards from your hand. Same thing with casting spells from your graveyard with Flashback. The most important thing about this is that your library can still be milled, and you can still be forced to draw cards from it, again, assuming that these effects are not targeting you. That is one of the loopholes around Teferi's protection, is that you can still lose the game while under the effects of Teferi's protection due to something like having to draw a card from an empty library. Earlier this episode, I mentioned that the podcast episode had gotten some things wrong as well as right. The right part was them probably referring to this card draw part as they didn't mention it explicitly. Some other things that maybe they were talking about would be if you happen to have some poison counters on you. Of course, if your opponent were to attack you with a Blightsteel Colossus and then you Teferi's protection to protect yourself from taking the combat damage that would be turned into poison counters, yes, that would work to save you. But what if you already had at least one poison counter on you? Maybe you have none, but an opponent casts an Ichor Rats, which gives a poison counter to every player on ATB. This doesn't target you, so you would still get the poison counter. Teferi's protection only phases out your permanents, and when something phases out, it does so with everything attached to it, including auras, equipments, fortifications, and yes, counters. But again, you haven't been phased out, just your permanents. So if you have at least one poison counter on you, then they can proliferate enough times to kill you with poison counters, as proliferate does not target at all, let alone target you as the thing with the counters on it. One last thing that I want to mention specifically in reference to what was talked about in that podcast episode, but they talked about how Teferi's protection does not help save you against commander damage, to which one of the other hosts does question this, but then he talks a bit about getting some judges to back it up and suggests that the commander damage cannot be prevented. Based on what he said, it sounds like the judges were getting into cases where damage cannot be prevented, like on a card like Alchemist's Gambit, but it sounded a bit like the guy thought that it was just a general rule that commander damage couldn't be prevented. So I just want to clarify, in case anyone were to encounter this in a game, if you were to attack me with your 21 power commander and I cast Teferi's protection before going to combat damage, then yes, Teferi's protection will save me. Commander damage is like lifelink, death touch, and infect. They alter the way that the damage is handled after being processed by the game, but the game would still need to see that damage potentially being dealt. Teferi's protection doesn't stop you from being attacked, but it will stop you from taking combat damage from a commander. And for commander damage to be tracked by the game, it has to be dealt as combat damage from that commander. Damage that is prevented. Okay. This episode has gotten to be long enough already, so I think that's a good spot to end on. Are there any aspects of Teferi's protection that you think I missed pointing out in this episode? Have you ever seen anything similar to the examples that I talked about in this episode, like the Genesis wave thing, or someone still getting milled and losing to an empty library while under the effects of Teferi's protection? Please do share anything like that in the comments. Also, if you can tell me how many times I've said Teferi's protection during this episode, I'll give you a massive internet high five. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that even a few of you may have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta.